San Mateo, California, June 5, 2023. Peter Anderson, a 48-year-old successful business owner, was found dead in his car just blocks from his suburban home. What initially appeared to be a sudden medical emergency soon raised questions, leading to an investigation that uncovered unsettling details about his life. As authorities unraveled the case, they discovered a story filled with obsession, hidden relationships, and a deadly betrayal that shocked the quiet community to its core. Peter Anderson was the kind of man people in the community admired. He owned a thriving home improvement business. His success had afforded him and his wife, Helen, a comfortable life, complete with a spacious home, regular vacations, and the kind of stability many envied. Helen was practical and devoted, running their household with precision, but she had grown weary of Peter's increasingly busy schedule. He often came home late, distracted by emails or client calls, leaving their conversations brief and transactional. Peter assumed their life was fine. They rarely argued, and he believed financial security was the cornerstone of a successful marriage. But Helen felt a growing void, one Peter hadn't even noticed. One afternoon, Peter had an appointment at the local hospital for a routine checkup. As he sat in the waiting room flipping through an outdated magazine, Alyssa Reynolds, a 26-year-old nurse, called his name. She had a warm smile that immediately put people at ease, and Peter wasn't immune to her charm. "Mr. Anderson? Follow me, please," Alyssa said, her voice professional yet friendly. Peter stood, offering a polite smile. "It's just Peter," he replied as he followed her down the hallway. The checkup went smoothly, with Alyssa asking routine questions and Peter responding with casual humor that seemed to lighten the mood. What struck Peter wasn't just her competence. It was the way she made him feel seen. Her attentiveness and genuine interest in his responses contrasted with the muted conversations he'd been having at home. For Alyssa, Peter was more than just another patient. His confident demeanor, combined with a sense of humility, intrigued her. She found herself lingering a little longer than necessary, asking questions about his business and laughing at his jokes. When the appointment was over, Peter thanked her, and she watched as he walked away, feeling a spark she hadn't felt in a long time. Their paths crossed again a few weeks later. Peter stopped by the hospital to drop off some paperwork he had forgotten during his visit, and Alyssa happened to be at the front desk. They exchanged pleasantries, and before he left, Alyssa casually mentioned a nearby cafe with great coffee, suggesting he try it. Peter, always polite, thanked her but didn't think much of it. A few days later, as Peter drove back from a meeting, he spotted the cafe Alyssa had mentioned. On a whim, he decided to stop in, and there she was, seated at a corner table during her break. She noticed him immediately and waved him over. "Small world," Peter said, smiling as he sat across from her. "It's the best coffee in town," Alyssa replied, her grin playful. "Guess I was right." Their conversation flowed effortlessly. Peter found himself opening up about his work and even sharing light-hearted complaints about how busy life had become. Alyssa listened intently, her eyes never leaving his, making him feel like he was the only person in the room. One coffee turned into several over the coming weeks. Their meetings became more intentional, often coinciding with Peter's errands or Alyssa's breaks. At first, it was innocent, two people sharing moments of connection. But the boundaries began to blur. Alyssa started sending Peter texts, little inside jokes or compliments about his work. Peter responded, flattered by the attention. As the weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Alyssa confided in Peter about her own frustrations, how her long hours at the hospital left her little time for a social life, and how she often felt overlooked by the people she cared about. Peter, in turn, shared details about his marriage that he hadn't even admitted to himself. "Helen and I don't talk like we used to," he admitted during one coffee meetup. "It's like we're roommates more than anything else." Alyssa nodded sympathetically, her hand briefly touching his across the table. "That sounds lonely," she said softly. It wasn't long before their connection became physical. One evening, after meeting at the cafe, Alyssa suggested they take a walk in the park nearby. The setting sun cast a warm glow as they strolled along the path, their conversation lingering on personal topics. When Alyssa stopped to admire the view, Peter stood close behind her, and before either of them fully realized what was happening, their lips met. From that moment, there was no going back. They began meeting more frequently, their rendezvous shifting to more private locations. For Peter, the affair was a thrilling escape from the monotony of his routine. It wasn't about love, at least, that's what he told himself. But for Alyssa, it was different. She started to fall for him, imagining a future where they could be together openly. Peter's kindness and attention filled a void she had long ignored, and she convinced herself that what they had was more than just an affair. She began to hope, expect, that Peter would leave Helen for her. Back at home, Helen noticed changes in Peter's behavior. He was distracted, his phone always close at hand. He smiled more, but it wasn't a smile she recognized. When she asked about his day, his answers were vague, and he rarely met her eyes. Peter, for his part, felt a pang of guilt each time he looked at Helen. But he rationalized it, telling himself that the affair wasn't hurting anyone. As long as he kept the two worlds separate, everything would be fine. Alyssa, however, wasn't content with secrecy. She began dropping hints about her feelings, testing Peter's reaction. "I wish we didn't have to hide this," she said during one of their meetings. Peter would deflect, changing the subject or reassuring her without making any promises. But Alyssa's patience had its limits. While Peter viewed their relationship as a temporary escape, Alyssa saw it as the start of something real. Her growing attachment and Peter's reluctance to commit would soon set the stage for tensions that neither of them could control. Alyssa's feelings for Peter had started as a harmless infatuation, but over time, they deepened into something much more intense. Every text, every glance, and every meeting seemed to feed her attachment. She found herself daydreaming about a life with him, one where they didn't have to meet in secret or pretend to be nothing more than acquaintances. But as Alyssa's hopes for a future together grew, so did her frustration with their current situation. Peter was always careful to avoid making promises, insisting that they keep things discreet. At first, she appreciated his caution. It made the affair feel exciting, like a secret only they shared. But now, the secrecy felt suffocating. When they met, Alyssa would drop subtle hints about how much she cared for him, hoping he would reciprocate. "Don't you wish we could just be open about this?" she asked one evening as they sat together in her apartment. Peter's response was always the same, a nervous chuckle, followed by a deflection. "It's complicated," he'd say. Alyssa started to feel like she was carrying the weight of their relationship alone. Every time Peter went home to Helen, Alyssa imagined him playing the role of a devoted husband, sitting at the dinner table, laughing at some inside joke only they shared. The thought made her stomach churn. Her jealousy of Helen began to grow, even though she'd never met her. In Alyssa's mind, Helen was everything standing in the way of the life she wanted. She pictured Helen as indifferent and cold, someone who didn't appreciate Peter the way she did. These thoughts festered, feeding her resentment. Alyssa's obsession began to manifest in small, possessive gestures. One day, while visiting Peter at his office, she intentionally left her scarf draped over the back of a chair. When Peter noticed, he handed it back to her with a raised eyebrow. "You forgot this," he said, his tone light but pointed. Alyssa simply smiled. She also started texting him more frequently, even during times she knew he was likely with Helen. The texts ranged from innocuous questions about his day to more flirtatious messages. At first, Peter found it endearing, but as the texts became more frequent, he began to feel cornered. "Can we talk about this later?" he texted back one evening after a particularly long string of messages. Alyssa didn't reply, but her frustration simmered beneath the surface. Peter, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain balance. Between his growing business and the affair, he felt stretched thin. Alyssa's demands for attention were starting to take a toll, and he began to dread the moments when his phone buzzed with her name. One afternoon, as he was reviewing blueprints for a client, a text from Alyssa popped up, "Thinking about you. Can't wait to see you tonight." Peter sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew he needed to talk to her about boundaries, but the thought of confronting her made him uneasy. Alyssa, however, was unaware of Peter's growing irritation. In her mind, every interaction was proof of their connection. She started to fantasize about how things would play out once Peter finally left Helen. She imagined them moving in together, traveling, building a life that was free of secrets and limitations. Her fixation on Helen intensified. She started asking Peter questions about his wife, framing them as casual curiosity but always probing for details. "What's she like?" she asked one evening. Peter shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "She's fine," he replied. "She's my wife." Alyssa pressed further, trying to find cracks in the image of their marriage. "Do you love her?" she asked. Peter hesitated, then gave a non-committal answer. "It's complicated," he said again. Alyssa took his hesitation as confirmation that his marriage was on the verge of collapse. She began to talk about Helen with increasing hostility, referring to her as the problem, or what's holding us back. Peter, growing tired of these conversations, would often change the subject or brush off her remarks, but Alyssa's resentment continued to build. One evening, Alyssa decided to test Peter's commitment to their relationship. She invited him over for dinner and cooked his favorite meal, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Over wine, she brought up the subject of their future together. "I need to know where this is going," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I can't keep doing this if you're not serious." Peter sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Alyssa, we've talked about this. I care about you, but I have responsibilities. It's not that simple." His words stung. To Alyssa, it sounded like an excuse, a way to keep her on the side while maintaining his comfortable life with Helen. Her face tightened, but she forced a smile, not wanting to push him further in the moment. After Peter left that night, Alyssa sat alone in her apartment, replaying the conversation in her head. She felt a mix of anger and sadness, convinced that Helen was the only thing keeping Peter from fully committing to her. She decided then and there that she wouldn't let Helen stand in her way. The next time Peter came to see her, Alyssa was colder, more calculated. She made subtle comments about how much happier he seemed when he was with her, planting seeds of doubt about his marriage. "You deserve to be with someone who really sees you," she said, her tone light but pointed. "Someone who appreciates everything you do." Peter nodded absent-mindedly, not realizing the full extent of what Alyssa was trying to imply. But her words stayed with him, creeping into his thoughts as he returned home to Helen. Alyssa, emboldened by her growing obsession, began making bolder moves. She started keeping a journal of their interactions, noting every detail of their time together. In her mind, it was proof of their connection, a way to hold on to him even when they were apart. Her fixation on Peter became all-consuming. She started to view Helen not just as an obstacle, but as someone who didn't deserve the life she had. Alyssa convinced herself that she could give Peter the happiness he needed if only Helen weren't in the picture. As her obsession deepened, Alyssa's behavior became harder for Peter to ignore. The possessive gestures, the constant texting, the veiled hostility toward Helen, it was all beginning to weigh on him. But he didn't know how to confront her without causing a scene. Peter had no idea that Alyssa's fixation was spiraling out of control. To him, it was just a fling, a temporary escape. But for Alyssa, it was everything. And she wasn't about to let it slip away. Peter had always been good at compartmentalizing his life. His marriage to Helen, his growing business, and now his secret relationship with Alyssa. He kept them all in separate boxes, believing none would interfere with the others. But lately, those boxes were starting to collide, and the stress of maintaining the facade was taking its toll. The excitement of the affair had begun to fade, replaced by the suffocating weight of Alyssa's growing demands. What had started as an escape was quickly turning into a source of constant tension. Alyssa wanted more of his time, more of his attention, and, increasingly, more commitment. Peter wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up with her expectations. To ease the strain, Peter started pulling back. He made excuses when Alyssa asked to meet, citing late nights at work or last-minute client calls. When she texted, he took longer to respond, often leaving her messages unread until the next day. He told himself it was better this way, that gradually distancing himself would cause the affair to fizzle out naturally without the need for an awkward confrontation. Alyssa, however, noticed the shift almost immediately. She felt his hesitation in the gaps between their conversations, in the half-hearted replies to her messages, and in the way he avoided making plans. At first, she convinced herself he was just busy, but as the days stretched into weeks, her anxiety grew. Determined not to lose him, Alyssa started taking matters into her own hands. One afternoon, Peter was at his office reviewing blueprints when Alyssa showed up unannounced. She walked in, her smile warm but her eyes searching. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by," she said casually, but the tension in her voice betrayed her. Peter glanced up, surprised but not pleased. "You really shouldn't be here," he said, keeping his tone light to avoid raising suspicion among his employees. Alyssa brushed off his comment, sitting on the edge of his desk as if she belonged there. "I've missed you," she said softly, leaning in slightly. Peter sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Alyssa, we talked about this. Work isn't the place for this kind of thing." Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, pretending to admire the blueprints on his desk. "You're working so hard. I just thought you could use a little break," she said. The encounter left Peter on edge. He realized he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Alyssa wasn't going to let things fade on their own. Meanwhile, at home, Helen was starting to notice Peter's distracted behavior. He was more irritable than usual, often zoning out during dinner or forgetting plans they'd made. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching television, Helen turned to him and asked, "Is everything okay with work?" Peter hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just a lot on my plate right now," he replied, avoiding her eyes. But Helen wasn't convinced. She began paying closer attention to Peter's habits, noticing how he always seemed to have his phone within arm's reach and how he often stepped outside to take calls. Her unease grew, but she kept her suspicions to herself, not wanting to spark a confrontation without proof. Alyssa's behavior, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly erratic. She started texting Peter at odd hours, her messages alternating between affectionate and accusatory. When he didn't respond quickly, she'd send follow-ups asking if something was wrong. One Saturday morning, Peter and Helen were at home when the doorbell rang. Peter opened the door to find Alyssa standing there, holding a coffee cup. His heart sank. "Hey," she said, her tone cheerful but her eyes sharp. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop this off. I know you like the mocha from that cafe near your office." Peter stepped outside, closing the door behind him before Helen could notice. "You can't just show up here," he said in a low voice, his irritation evident. Alyssa's expression hardened. "Why are you acting like this?" "I'm just trying to be nice," she said, her voice tinged with hurt. Peter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Alyssa, you need to stop. This isn't working anymore. I can't do this." Her face fell, but before she could respond, Peter turned and went back inside, leaving her standing on the porch. Helen, watching from the kitchen, asked, "Who was that?" "Just someone from work," Peter replied quickly, brushing off the question. The tension in their marriage was becoming unbearable. Helen's growing suspicions and Peter's constant worry about Alyssa left him feeling trapped. He knew he had to confront Alyssa directly, but he dreaded the fallout. The breaking point came one evening when Alyssa showed up at his office again, this time after hours. Peter was the only one there, wrapping up some paperwork, when she walked in unannounced. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Peter set down his pen, already exhausted. "Alyssa, this has to stop," he said. Her eyes filled with tears, but her tone was sharp. "Why are you pulling away? What changed?" Peter hesitated, knowing he couldn't keep stringing her along. "I'm not leaving Helen," he said finally. Whatever this is, it has to end." Alyssa stared at him, her face a mix of shock and anger. "So, what? I was just some distraction for you? Something to pass the time?" Peter looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry, Alyssa. I never meant for it to get this far." Her voice broke as she said, "You made me believe we had a future. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" Peter didn't respond, and Alyssa stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. That night, Peter went home feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He thought ending things with Alyssa would bring relief, but instead, it left him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. Something about the way she had looked at him before leaving made him uneasy, and he knew this wasn't over. Alyssa's world began to crumble the moment Peter rejected her. His words replayed in her mind like a haunting echo. This has to end. The relationship that had once made her feel alive now left her hollow, consumed by feelings of betrayal and humiliation. She couldn't understand how Peter could turn his back on her so easily after everything they'd shared. Sitting alone in her apartment, Alyssa allowed her thoughts to spiral. Every rational voice in her head was drowned out by the anger and resentment she felt toward Peter and toward Helen. In Alyssa's eyes, Helen was the reason Peter wouldn't commit. If she weren't in the picture, Alyssa believed, Peter would finally see what they could have together. That belief festered into an obsession, one that would drive her to actions she never thought herself capable of. Her jealousy sharpened into a dangerous resolve. Alyssa began toying with the idea of taking matters into her own hands, using the skills and knowledge she'd gained as a nurse. Late at night, she scrolled through medical articles and case studies, researching medications that could be lethal but difficult to trace. She kept her searches vague, knowing full well how dangerous it was to leave a digital trail. At work, Alyssa started paying closer attention to the drugs stored in the hospital's secure inventory. She knew the protocols for accessing controlled substances, and her years of experience gave her insight into how to avoid detection. She was methodical, biding her time and ensuring every move was calculated. Meanwhile, Peter had thrown himself into trying to repair his marriage. Ending things with Alyssa had been messy, but he was determined to put it behind him. He started making more of an effort at home, surprising Helen with flowers and offering to cook dinner, a gesture that hadn't happened in years. One evening, Peter came home with an idea for a weekend getaway. "Just the two of us," he told Helen. "We could use the time to reconnect." Helen was hesitant at first, still unsure of Peter's intentions after weeks of his distracted behavior. But eventually, she agreed, hoping this was the fresh start they both needed. Peter booked a cozy cabin by the lake, picturing peaceful walks and quiet nights where they could finally talk. Word of Peter's renewed focus on his marriage reached Alyssa through a mutual acquaintance, one of Peter's employees, who casually mentioned that Peter had been planning a romantic weekend for his wife. Alyssa's stomach churned at the thought. It wasn't just rejection she felt now. It was betrayal. "He's trying to fix things with her," she muttered to herself, pacing her apartment. The idea that Peter could so easily turn his back on their relationship and act as if nothing had happened enraged her. In her mind, he had promised her something more, even if he'd never said the words outright. Fueled by anger, Alyssa became even more determined to follow through on her plan. She began rehearsing how she could gain access to the drug she needed, running through scenarios in her head to ensure everything went smoothly. The hospital had strict security measures, but Alyssa knew the system inside and out. She waited until her shift overlapped with one of the less diligent staff members, using the opportunity to retrieve a small vial and falsify the inventory records. The vial felt heavy in her pocket as she walked out of the hospital that night. The weight wasn't physical. It was the enormity of what she was about to do. But Alyssa didn't hesitate. In her mind, this was the only way to set things right. Peter, oblivious to Alyssa's actions, continued preparing for the trip with Helen. He spent his free time looking up local restaurants near the cabin and planning activities he thought Helen would enjoy. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful about their future. On the surface, Helen appeared receptive to Peter's efforts, but she remained guarded. His sudden shift in behavior felt too convenient, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. Still, she decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, hoping the getaway would provide some clarity. Alyssa's obsession, meanwhile, grew stronger by the day. She began imagining how different her life would be without Helen in the picture. In her mind, Peter would be devastated at first, but would eventually realize Alyssa was the one who truly understood him. She pictured them moving in together, starting fresh, and building the life she had always dreamed of. But Alyssa knew that her plan had to be flawless. One mistake could expose her and ruin everything. She meticulously researched the drug's effects, ensuring she understood how much to use and how quickly it would work. She rehearsed scenarios in her head, preparing for every possible outcome. As the weekend approached, Alyssa decided she couldn't wait any longer. She texted Peter, framing the message as casual but knowing it would catch him off guard. "I think we need to talk. Can you come over?" Peter stared at the message for a long moment before responding. He knew he shouldn't see her, but part of him felt guilty for how abruptly he had ended things. Just for a few minutes, he told himself, ignoring the nagging voice in his head. When Peter arrived at Alyssa's apartment, she greeted him with a forced smile, her demeanor calm but her eyes betraying the storm beneath the surface. "Thanks for coming," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I can't stay long," Peter said, his tone cautious. Alyssa nodded, pouring him a glass of wine as they began to talk. She kept the conversation light at first, asking about his business and avoiding any mention of Helen. But as the evening wore on, her questions became more pointed. "Do you ever think about what we had?" she asked, her voice soft. Peter hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Alyssa, I told you, things between us had to end. I'm trying to move forward." Alyssa's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I understand," she said, her tone measured. But in her mind, she was already thinking about the vial hidden in her kitchen cabinet, waiting for the moment to put her plan into action. As Peter left that night, he felt uneasy but relieved to have avoided a confrontation. What he didn't know was that Alyssa's resolve had only strengthened. She had everything she needed to carry out her plan, and in her mind, there was no turning back. Alyssa spent the entire day preparing. She cleaned her apartment meticulously, ensuring every detail was perfect. A bottle of Peter's favorite wine sat chilling in an ice bucket on the counter, next to two polished glasses. The lighting in the living room was soft, warm, and inviting, designed to make Peter feel at ease. But the real preparation had taken place in her mind. She'd gone over every word she planned to say, every move she would make, ensuring there was no room for error. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the vial from its hiding spot in the kitchen. She had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head that it almost felt routine. She carefully measured out the dose into a small dropper, her breath steadying as she reminded herself that this was the only way forward. Peter, meanwhile, was hesitant about meeting Alyssa. Her text had been simple: "Can we talk? I need closure." He'd spent hours debating whether or not to go, knowing it was a risk, but part of him wanted to end things on good terms. He convinced himself that meeting her one last time would put everything behind him. As he pulled up outside Alyssa's apartment, Peter's unease grew. The lights inside glowed warmly, and her silhouette appeared in the window, as if she had been waiting for him. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his keys and headed inside. Alyssa greeted him at the door with a smile that felt almost too calm. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. She motioned for him to come in, her demeanor so composed that Peter felt a momentary wave of relief. Maybe this really would be as simple as she had promised. "Can I get you a drink?" she asked, gesturing to the wine on the counter. Peter hesitated, glancing at the bottle. "I probably shouldn't. I still have work to do tonight," he said. Alyssa waved off his concern, pouring a glass anyway. "One drink won't hurt," she said lightly, handing it to him before pouring one for herself. Peter took the glass reluctantly, sitting down on the couch as Alyssa settled into the chair across from him. The room felt too quiet, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Alyssa started the conversation casually, asking about his business and making small talk about mutual acquaintances. Peter answered politely but kept his responses brief, eager to steer the conversation toward closure. "I just want to say I'm sorry," Peter said finally, setting his glass down on the coffee table. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alyssa. I didn't handle things the way I should have." Alyssa nodded, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied, though her tone was flat. For a moment, Peter thought things were going well. But then Alyssa's demeanor shifted. Her calm facade began to crack, her voice taking on an edge as she leaned forward in her chair. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me, Peter?" she asked, her words sharp. Peter stiffened, sensing the conversation was taking a turn. "Alyssa, You made me believe we had a future," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You made me feel like I mattered, and then you just threw me away like I was nothing." Peter stood, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Alyssa, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but this has to end." Alyssa rose to her feet, her eyes blazing. "And? You think you can just walk away from me? After everything we've been through?" Peter stepped back, his unease mounting. "I think I should go," he said, his tone firm. But Alyssa blocked his path, her voice softening suddenly. "Please, Peter, don't leave like this. Just sit down. Have one more drink with me. Let's at least part on good terms." Peter hesitated, glancing toward the door. But Alyssa's pleading expression made him pause. Against his better judgment, he sat back down, picking up his glass. Alyssa smiled, the tension in the room seeming to dissipate. She picked up her own glass and raised it. "To closure," she said, clinking her glass against his. Peter took a sip, unaware of the invisible line he had just crossed. Alyssa watched him closely, her heart pounding as she waited for the drug to take effect. She had timed everything perfectly. The dose, the wine, the moment. Now, all she had to do was wait. As the minutes passed, Peter began to feel strange. His vision blurred slightly, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. "I don't feel so good," he murmured, setting his glass down. Alyssa's expression remained calm, though her heart raced. "You're probably just tired," she said soothingly. "Why don't you lie down for a bit?" Peter tried to stand, but his legs felt weak. He stumbled, gripping the edge of the couch for support. What's happening?" he mumbled, his voice slurred. Alyssa stood and placed a hand on his shoulder, gently easing him back onto the couch. "It's okay," she whispered, her tone almost tender. "Just rest." Peter's eyes fluttered shut as his body went limp, the drug taking full effect. Alyssa stood over him, her mind racing with a mix of triumph and fear. She had done it. There was no turning back now. For a moment, she just stood there, staring down at Peter as he lay unconscious. A wave of emotion washed over her, relief, anger, and a strange sense of control. This was her chance to take back everything she felt Peter had taken from her. Alyssa moved quickly, disposing of the evidence and cleaning up the apartment. She placed Peter's glass in the sink, wiping it down carefully before pouring the rest of the wine down the drain. She checked his pockets for anything incriminating, removing his phone and turning it off. As the minutes ticked by, Alyssa rehearsed her next steps in her mind. She had planned every detail, but now that the moment was here, the weight of what she had done began to sink in. Finally, she took a deep breath and picked up her own phone, dialing a number with shaking fingers. "There's been an emergency," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Alyssa hung up and glanced back at Peter one last time. She knew the story she would tell, the lies she would weave to explain everything. But deep down, she also knew the truth would eventually catch up to her. The night Peter left Alyssa's apartment, he could feel something was wrong. His body felt heavy, his vision blurred, and his thoughts were muddled. He assumed it was exhaustion, a consequence of juggling work, home, and the emotional strain of ending the affair. But as he drove down the quiet streets toward home, the unease grew unbearable. Peter pulled his car to the side of the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the empty block. His breathing was labored, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to grab his phone from the passenger seat to call Helen, but couldn't steady his hands. Within moments, his body slumped against the steering wheel, his breaths shallow and uneven. By the time a passing car spotted his vehicle and called for help, it was too late. At the scene, first responders noted no obvious signs of foul play. To them, it looked like a tragic case of a man succumbing to health complications. Peter had a documented history of high blood pressure and mild heart issues, making a heart attack a plausible explanation. By the time his body was taken to the hospital, the assumption was clear: natural causes had claimed his life. When Helen received the news, her world shattered. She couldn't comprehend how Peter, seemingly healthy and vibrant, could be gone so suddenly. Friends and family rallied around her, offering condolences and support as she planned the funeral. Among those present was Alyssa, standing quietly at the back of the room, her face a mask of carefully practiced grief. Alyssa played the part perfectly, expressing just enough sadness to appear credible without drawing too much attention to herself. She approached Helen with a soft voice and a sympathetic expression, offering hollow words of comfort. Peter spoke so highly of you, she said, placing a hand on Helen's shoulder. He loved you deeply. Helen, too overwhelmed to notice the strange undertone in Alyssa's words, nodded absently. But Peter's closest friends, particularly his business partner Mike, couldn't help but feel something was off. Alyssa's presence at the funeral didn't make sense to them. While Peter was friendly with many people, her face was unfamiliar, and the subtle way she lingered near the proceedings raised questions in their minds. The medical examiner finalized the initial report, citing a heart attack as the cause of death. But something about the suddenness of Peter's collapse didn't sit right with Detective Anna Harris, a seasoned investigator with a knack for noticing what others overlooked. She reviewed the case files and requested a deeper look into Peter's medical history. The timeline didn't add up. Peter's recent checkups had shown no alarming changes, and his prescribed medications were accounted for. Detective Harris began piecing together the hours leading up to Peter's death. Interviews with Helen and Peter's colleagues revealed a seemingly ordinary day, but one detail caught her attention. A neighbor near Alyssa's apartment mentioned seeing Peter's car parked there earlier that evening. When pressed, the neighbor recalled seeing Peter leave, looking unsteady as he got into his car. Harris tracked down Alyssa and brought her in for questioning. Alyssa maintained her composure, explaining that Peter had come over to talk about work-related stress and that they'd parted on good terms. He seemed fine when he left, she said, her tone even. While her story appeared plausible, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that Alyssa wasn't being entirely truthful. Alyssa's demeanor was too controlled, her grief too measured, as though rehearsed. Harris requested a toxicology report, a routine step in cases where natural causes seemed questionable. As the days passed, Alyssa worked hard to maintain her cover. She returned to her job at the hospital, pretending to be just another nurse grieving a tragic loss in the community. But the pressure of keeping her secret began to weigh on her. She avoided eye contact with colleagues, spoke in clipped tones, and jumped whenever her phone buzzed. Helen, meanwhile, was struggling to make sense of Peter's sudden death. She replayed their final days together in her mind, searching for any signs she might have missed. The romantic evening Peter had planned, the way he seemed unusually distant yet focused. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. Then the toxicology report came back. It revealed traces of a drug in Peter's system that he had no prescription for and no medical reason to take. The substance was known to cause cardiac arrest in certain doses, and its presence immediately raised red flags for Harris. This was no longer a case of natural causes. It was now a potential homicide investigation. Harris returned to Alyssa's apartment, this time with a search warrant. Inside, she found remnants of Peter's favorite wine bottle and an empty vial in the trash, a vial that matched the substance found in Peter's system. The evidence was circumstantial but damning, and Harris knew she was getting closer to uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, Alyssa's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She noticed colleagues whispering when she walked past and grew increasingly paranoid about being watched. Her once calculated composure gave way to erratic behavior, snapping at coworkers and avoiding social interactions. When Harris questioned Alyssa again, the cracks in her story began to show. Alyssa stumbled over details she had confidently stated before, and her body language betrayed her growing fear. Harris pressed harder, bringing up inconsistencies and hinting at the mounting evidence against her. By this point, whispers about Alyssa's relationship with Peter had begun circulating among his friends. Mike, Peter's business partner, came forward with his own suspicions, recounting instances where Peter had seemed distracted and evasive. "I knew something was off," Mike said, "but I didn't think it would end like this." The final piece of the puzzle came when Harris uncovered security footage from a nearby shop showing Peter leaving Alyssa's apartment on the night of his death. The footage, combined with the toxicology report and the items found in Alyssa's trash, painted a chilling picture. The net was closing in, and Alyssa knew it. Her once confident and meticulous approach had left behind too many loose ends, and Harris was determined to tie them all together. As the investigation deepened, Alyssa's double life unraveled, leaving her with nowhere to hide. As the investigation deepened, Detective Anna Harris and her team uncovered the full extent of Alyssa's relationship with Peter. Text records from Peter's phone revealed months of messages between the two, ranging from flirtatious exchanges to thinly veiled arguments about their future together. Witness testimonies painted an equally damning picture, with Peter's business partner, neighbors, and even Alyssa's co-workers confirming suspicions of an affair. Alyssa's position as a nurse gave her direct access to the drug found in Peter's system. Hospital records showed discrepancies in inventory logs during her shifts, and a review of her work schedule confirmed she had ample opportunity to acquire the substance. Detectives cross-referenced the timeline, and the evidence became impossible to ignore. When Alyssa was brought in for questioning, she initially stuck to her story, claiming Peter's visit was innocent and that he had left her apartment in good health. But as detectives presented the mounting evidence, security footage, toxicology results, and the items found in her trash, Alyssa's confidence began to crumble. She grew defensive, her answers becoming contradictory and evasive. In a moment of panic, she let slip details about Peter's condition that had not been publicly disclosed, effectively sealing her fate. The final blow came from Alyssa's apartment, where investigators found her internet search history, detailing the effects of the drug and how to administer it. Combined with the leftover vial in her trash and her pattern of obsessive behavior, the case against her was airtight. With no way out, Alyssa was arrested and charged. In court, the shocking details of her obsession and calculated plan unfolded, leaving those who knew her stunned. The affair, the manipulation, and the cold premeditation revealed a darker side to Alyssa that no one had suspected, ensuring her actions would not go unpunished. The court ruled that Alyssa was responsible for Peter's death. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Her once promising nursing career and reputation were left in ruins. The trial drew national attention, with the media focusing on her obsessive relationship with Peter and her chilling use of medical knowledge to carry out the crime. Prosecutors emphasized her calculated actions and the lengths she went to in order to control Peter, while the defense struggled against the overwhelming evidence. Friends, colleagues, and patients were shocked by the revelation, unable to reconcile the Alyssa they knew with the person exposed in court.